Very much for coming this evening. I know there are a number of other attractions tonight. In particular, you could have been going to the Liberal Democrats' business dinner, which I see from the conference programme is... You've just come from that, right? Well,
I'm just about to go to it.
And you're just about to go. I expect your
David's leftover.
I expect your tickets were free, but you could have bought a premium table of 10 places for £5,000, or just an ordinary table of 10 places for £3,500. Party officials tell me that these rates are 40% up on what they were when the Liberal Democrats were in opposition. So this may or may not be a sign of inflation. Or it may be a sign of how the Liberal Democrats have changed in government and in coalition. And that is what tonight's meeting is about. How much has entering government changed the Liberal Democrats? How much has the deficit reduction programme led the Liberal Democrats in a different direction economically? Are the days of high spending pledges over? And is the leadership of the Liberal Democrats now decisively free market liberal? And indeed, will it stay that way? We've got a distinguished panel here tonight. I'm afraid a couple of the MPs have got to leave early, so rather than introduce everybody now and waste more time, I'm going to fire off straight away with David Laws and then Jeremy Browne, ask the questions, and then come to the other speakers. So, David Laws, what are your thoughts on all of that? You were, I suppose, you're more associated with the deficit reduction programme than anybody apart from Danny Alexander, even though you were only there 19 days. And whatever you do in politics from now, you will be linked with it, whether you want to be or not.
Michael, thank you. And before I start off with a few brief comments, I'd just like to thank firstly the IEA for sponsoring the event, and Michael, to you for chairing it, and to note that you have embarked on a new political career today, we understand, having moved from the BBC to Channel 4 News, is that right?
That's right, and indeed the BBC wouldn't let you do things like this, you see, because they think they then associate me with the views of the IEA, so I've now got a new freedom.
However, having seen some of your piece on Channel 4 News, we're delighted to know that you haven't left your wonderful, distinct, mischievous political style of reporting behind. We look forward to seeing that in the future. Look, particularly as Jeremy and I have got commitments that mean that we can't stay for the full hour, I want to make my comments fairly brief so that we can have more of a debating discussion rather than an address. And therefore, there are just 3 points, therefore, that I want to make. The first point is that I think that, notwithstanding the fact that this coalition has come into being in very particular economic circumstances, which mean that we should not necessarily take a read across that the Liberal Democrats have changed so much that every time we get into government in the future we're going to want to cut public expenditure by 25%. I think the party does deserve some credit from my perspective in the way that it's dealt with coalition, in the way that it has recognised the challenges that there are in the current economic environment, and in the way in which it's been willing to accept some really quite tough and difficult and unpopular things that we've had to do, particularly on public spending, also to some extent on tax, but particularly on public spending, which run very much against the natural propensity of the Liberal Democrats for a long period of time to emphasise investment in public services and to be pro-spending rather than pro-savings within the public sector budget. And I think that that is a recognition not only of the circumstances that the coalition faces and that led to the formation of the coalition government, but also of the fact that the Liberal Democrats during the coalition period and in the years running up to it embraced a more economically liberal and credible approach both to economic policy, to public service improvement and to some of the tough choices which any body in government has to make. I think the party deserves credit for that. The second point is that I think that it's fair to say that in the first year of the government, and I think Nick Clegg made this point today in the Q&A, we put a great deal of emphasis on demonstrating to people that coalition government, that partnership government could actually work to a sceptical public. And that meant a great deal of discipline in the way we presented coalition policy. It meant a tendency to sort out problems and to apply pressure behind the scenes rather than in front of the scenes. And I think it meant that after the first year, we faced a public which felt that coalition was actually working very well, that partnership between political parties was much easier than they'd expected, but in which they felt that the Liberal Democrat identity in government was diluted too much, that they were not hearing enough from us, that they were worried that the fact that they were not seeing these arguments in public meant that we were not using our power and influence behind the scenes, and that we were not having a distinct enough Liberal Democrat impact on the coalition. I think our challenge in this second year, and going into the third year and the fourth year for that matter, is to make sure that we strike the right balance between demonstrating to people that coalition and partnership government can work, and demonstrating that the Liberal Democrats have a distinct position to offer, that we're willing to say no to things that the Conservative Party may wish to do that run counter to our values or our beliefs about the way government should be conducted. But I think that there is a risk that we have to acknowledge that if we emphasise too much differentiation and swing too much from one extreme in the first year to an extreme in the second or third years, that we are going to look to the public more like an internal opposition that sees its role within government as being simply that of being a brake rather than being an engine. And I think that there clearly are some things in government that we will want to put the brakes on. There are clearly some directions that the Conservative Party might want to go that we would not want to follow. But I see this opportunity, not just for us as Liberal Democrats, but from the perspective of the public wanting to see us deliver in government, as one that is much more than about being a brake. And I think we need to use the time in government to be an engine of ideas and to take the responsibility that comes with government. And that isn't only because I think that that's important from a public perspective. It is that if you're in a coalition government, a partnership government, you have to be able to win influence and win the consent of your partners for the policies that you want to see by having a sensible and constructive relationship with them, and not one in which you view them as punch bags, and not one in which you spend all your time throwing stones. I think the third and last point that I would make is this. Have the Liberal Democrats changed in the period of the run-up to 2010? Yes, I think we did. Have we changed further and matured further in this first stressful year in government? Yes, I think we have. Are the changes that we've made in our policy and approach over the last few years going to be sustained in the latter part of the government, and particularly as we go beyond 2015? I think inevitably that depends, not only on the lessons that the party learns from this period of time, not only from our maturing in government, but also about how successful that process is, and to the extent to which we in government manage to use our period, not just to sort out some of the economic mess, but to deliver on the programme of social recovery, greater opportunity in education, reform of welfare, which we're so passionate about. When political parties move away from what has been their natural centre of gravity, the risk is that they return to that centre of gravity if that process is not perceived to have been a success at the end of the period where people evaluate it. And I think what we've seen with the Labour Party having moved under Blair is that because the latter parts of that period of time are associated with failure over Iraq, a sense that the government did not achieve over some of its social policy objectives, the natural tendency of the Labour Party has been to drift back towards where they were pre-Blair. And the challenge for those of us of a more orange book tendency, who believe that some of the changes in the party over the last 2 years have been a good thing, is to demonstrate in government that we are more than competent economic managers, but that we can also use our time here to deliver on the social policy programme of the government. And if we simply conclude our period in government after 4 or 5 years, having sorted out some of the economic mess, but having made no progress in making Britain a fairer place, a place of greater opportunity, then the tendency in the party will be to regard that period of time either as a failure or as a temporary aberration as a consequence of the election result in 2010 and the economic circumstances of the time, and therefore to pull the party back in the direction of the types of positions on economic policy and on public services that we had prior to both the coalition and perhaps the publication of the Orange Book in 2004.
David, thank you very much. I'll go straight on to... Straight on to the one member of the government on the platform tonight, Jeremy Browne.
Thank you. Can I also join David in congratulating you on your new role and your new freedom? You all seem to have quite enough freedom before for most people's taste, but I'm pleased you've got even more now. Well, as David had 3 points, let me try 3 points on you as well, which I think will, I hope, chime with what David said, but may offer you a few other pointers. The first, let me run a sort of exercise past you. Let's say that our coalition partners, the Conservative Party, when they gathered in 2 weeks' time in Manchester, faced the following set of circumstances. They had been on the losing side on the referendum on AV. In other words, there had been a decisive yes vote. They'd done very badly in the local council elections in May. And their party was polling less than half of what it had polled at the general election. So in their case, about 16%, roughly. Now, I know everybody in the room is probably thinking that sounds like an ideal scenario. Why is it us and not them? And that's an interesting discussion and a separate discussion. But the point I want to impress upon you and any media who are here is that were that the case, how disciplined do you think the Conservative members would be at that conference in Manchester? How much resolve would they have to carry on with the difficult but necessary measures that we have to undertake in government? How unflinching would they be in their determination to honour the agreement to stay in the coalition in the national interest for the full 5 years of this Parliament? And the point I'm making is that I actually think that there is one party more than any other in Britain today that has all the traits of a natural party of government, a party that can make decisive decisions in the national interest, regardless of short-term pressures on that party. And amazingly, because I think most people would have not given this as the answer a couple of years ago, I think that party is the Liberal Democrats. I think we have more unity and more resolve and more resilience than the other two parties when it comes to making decisions that are in the national interest. And that is a huge prize for us, because anybody who has ever stood for the Lib Dems must have been confronted with the view that we are peripheral, that we are a wasted vote, that when it comes to actually making a real decision about who governs the country, there are only two choices available, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And certainly in my seat, that cost me at the last general election. I held my seat, but there were plenty of people who said that they were well disposed towards the Lib Dems, but there was only one way you could get rid of Gordon Browne, and that was to vote for the Conservatives. We were not a viable governing option. And what I want at the next election and subsequent elections is for people to think there are three viable governing options in Britain, or two if you discard the Labour Party, and we are one of those three. But I think in order to do that, we have to think like a governing party. I don't think, as David just said himself, that we can aspire to being both a party of government and a party of opposition at the same time. I want us to have a distinctive identity because we are a distinctive entity. We are a separate political party from the Conservatives. We have our own history, we have our own traditions, we have our own style, we have our own ideology, we have our own policies. But what we shouldn't do is push differentiation to the point where we spend our time thinking as ourselves as an alternative source of power that is there to campaign against what is a government with more Conservative ministers in it than Lib Dems. I think that is a danger for us because it will show people that when it comes to the crunch, we are inherently not willing to take on the tough tasks that government entails, and which we have shown that we have been hitherto able to accommodate. And if I wanted to set a sort of test for the party, it would be that we shouldn't measure our achievements in government by how many Conservative initiatives we manage to frustrate. We should measure our success in government by how many Lib Dem initiatives we manage to implement. After all, we've had 70 years of not being able to implement any, so we must have a fair backlog to get through. And this is an amazing, amazing opportunity for our party. What a privilege. All those people that kept the sort of faint flame of liberalism flickering through the 50s and the 60s in particular. To look at us now, what an opportunity. And for us to be sitting there thinking about it negatively is a complete, in my view, betrayal of those people. And I'm very, very pleased that the mood of this conference has been so resilient and has been so positive about how we can make government work, not just for us, but for the people in this country. Second point, to get more to the nub of this evening's conversation, is I think if a party spends a long time in opposition, it becomes oppositionist in its mindset. It thinks about how it can oppose what people who are responsible for policy are doing. And I think inevitably we became oppositionist because we spent so long in opposition. And that isn't a particular trait that is unique to the Liberal Democrats. So I think the Labour Party have become very oppositionist, and they've only been in opposition for 16 months. And if you don't believe me, listen to Harriet Harman only a few weeks ago saying that Labour didn't accept any of the cuts that the government was implementing. So we are borrowing about £400 million every single day. I mean, people say to me about the Foreign Office, we borrow more in a weekend than we spend annually on global diplomacy. That is the state of the deficit that we face as a party, and yet the principal opposition party don't accept that there is a case for any cuts. In fact, you even have the Labour Party outflanking Liam Fox on the right by arguing that the Conservatives are cutting more in defence than they would be willing to cut. Well, it's an extraordinary position, in my view, for an opposition party to take. But it does show the danger that thinking like an opposition party rather than thinking like an alternative party of government holds for political parties. And I think it's very important for us to make that transition. We are undergoing some quite substantial growing pains, in my view, a sort of adolescent transition as a party from thinking like an opposition party to thinking like a government. But the prize for that is that we are able to implement our ideas in government. And my third point is, what are those ideas? And I'm not anti the state, which I think is a caricature of the so-called Orange Book Lib Dems, but I don't assume that the state is the starting point for finding solutions to all social or economic problems. And my liberalism combines individual freedom with allowing people, regardless of their circumstances, to realise their potential and realise the opportunities that potentially exist for them. And the state can be an enabler in that process. I am a very strong supporter of the pupil premium, which was David's initiative in opposition, thinking like a government minister rather than just thinking of ways of opposing the last Labour government, and now being implemented by the Lib Dems in government. A massive prize for our party and a massive demonstration of our commitment to trying to help people get into positions where they can realise their full potential regardless of the circumstances of their parents. So the state can have and does have an enabling role, but I think we have in the past sometimes been too quick to believe that the statist solutions are automatically better than alternative solutions. I am actually a supporter of the big society. I just call the big society liberalism. And what I mean by that liberalism is that people should have more opportunity to shape their life, to make choices that they feel are suitable for them. We have a preamble in our constitution. We talk about being suspicious of conformity and orthodoxy. Well, I'm suspicious of conformity and orthodoxy. I want people to be able to make those decisions about their lives, whether it's having incentives to work. So I think our cut of the starting point of tax so that people have more incentives to work and more of their own money to spend how they see fit is important. I'm in favour of incentives to trade. I'm in favour of open markets. I'm in favour of us having an internationalist approach. And I'm in favour of individual freedom, which I think is a part of the party-polity mix which has been under-emphasised. I think people, Mark will be sympathetic to this, but I think some of the party's sentiments in the past on alcohol taxation or fat taxes for me, jar with a liberal emphasis on individual responsibility. So there is a package of liberal measures, if we are willing to think creatively, which I think are very attractive and chime with the mood of the country. And if we can put together a hard-headed economic responsibility agenda and deal with the deficit, but at the same time show a social compassion which isn't just about spending money, but is about enabling people to realise their potential, then I think our future as a party is very bright. And we will look back on this period as the point where we built the really solid ideological foundations that we have, if we're honest with ourselves, not had because we lacked definition in opposition, and we now can have because we can give ourselves that identity which will, in my view, make liberalism attractive and viable for many more millions of voters at the next election and beyond.
Jeremy, thank you. For the first time in my life, I've just tweeted while chairing a meeting something that somebody said at the meeting. We are now the natural party of government. Anyway, let me open it up to the floor while David and Jeremy are still with us. So, contributions. That gentleman there.
Yes, Mark Ramsbottom from Manchester Central. My question is about whether or not we think that there is a risk that the party could become more southern-based, given the drubbing that we took in the local elections and in Scotland, that we are losing some of the ground that we've obviously clearly made up over the last few years by the unpopularity of the Labour government. Are we not in danger, or is there a risk that we continue on that trend and lose more seats in the north and some of our northern cities?
Is there another contribution before I... yes, maybe there.
Rachel Spring.
Sorry, Rachel.
I was interested that Jeremy harked back to the 50s when the Liberal electoral flicker was only kept alive because the Conservatives didn't stand against it. Is that something you're contemplating?
Well, I'll answer that one. And the other one.
No, sorry, that wasn't deliberate, and I don't think our prospects as a party are reliant on the charity of other political parties. In fact, in Somerset, David and I both represent constituencies in Somerset. We have 4 of the 5 MPs. It's the only part of Britain we would lose out with proportional representation. So we are living examples of the robust ability that the party has to take on the Conservatives head to head and be successful. I think the interesting thing about 1950s, very quickly, I'm sort of switch the question slightly political way, is if you look at the 1950s general elections, Labour and the Conservatives between them got something like 98% of the vote. They had a very class-based, polarised society reflected in politics, very high turnouts but very little churn between the two parties. People saw voting for either Labour and the Conservatives as part of a sort of badge of identity that went along with their other class-based identities. We now live in a much more socially fluid society. When I was first elected an MP, 2005, was the first general election since universal suffrage was introduced where the combined Labour and Conservative vote fell below 70%. The last election was the first one where it fell below 2/3 of the people who voted. And that is a clear trend, and that provides a real opportunity for us having a less class-based, less hierarchical society, which in my view is receptive to liberalism. And it leads quite neatly on to the question about the north of England. I think it is a risk. I think we all know it's a risk, and we saw that in the elections in May, where there was a north-south divide in the party's performance. And it wasn't uniform. There were places in the north we did fairly well, and there were places in the south we didn't do so well. But overall, that was the pattern. I think the task for us as a party is to identify a persuasive form of liberalism, and I tried to touch upon that in my introductory remarks, which are an effective alternative to municipal socialism in northern cities. I don't think there's an appetite for conservatism, but I don't think we can sell ourselves as superior managers to inadequate Labour parties in those cities. I think we have to show that liberalism is distinctive from what they offer, that we are more responsive, we have more community-based politics, but also our liberalism is a better solution to the concerns that people have in those cities. And so I I suppose I would say it's a challenge for us, is how we use the adversity that we face to adapt so that we can bring forward a policy offer which is attractive to the electorate.
Briefly, David Laws.
Yeah, I mean, on the first question, I think it's already interesting that in some parts of the country we're seeing in the south and southwest some of the tactical Labour voters who actually were concerned about the coalition, upset by it, and who may not have supported us in the local elections at the beginning of this year. I actually have noticed in some of the by-elections that we've had, including in our own area of Somerset, some of those people drifting back on side, not only because they I think have been more impressed over the last 3, 4, 5 months over some of the things the party has been doing this year to make its distinctiveness clear in government, but also because many of them have realised essentially that if they use their votes to back Labour, they may well end up with Conservative councillors or Conservative members of Parliament. In other words, they're getting that message that previously they had got very clearly. There clearly is a challenge in parts of the north, where, in particular, the Labour Party support was in meltdown after Iraq and because of the Labour failure in office. And there clearly is often a cycle to these things where parties that are in government for a very long period of time tend to see a massive erosion of their local government base. The Tories saw it between 79 and 97, Labour saw it between 97 and 2010, and there will undoubtedly be some areas in the north when Labour were in power where we will have picked up easy winnings which were more about Labour unpopularity in government than necessarily the brilliance of everything we were doing in those areas. And that is going to be challenging. We've seen that already. But I think one of the things we have to recognise is that local elections are local elections, and the party in local government, and many of our local people in local government are already saying this, need to recognise that being in national government is not simply an excuse for giving up. And in the majority of areas of the country, we are not, sadly, the government in local government, and we have every opportunity to fight locally for the things that we believe in, to criticise those parties that are in power, to campaign against them, to campaign in the ground community politics way that the party has made its own for the last 30 or 40 years. And we must not get in the mindset in any part of the country of thinking that we cannot win because we are part of the national government, when in virtually all of local government, sadly, we are not the government.
Now you're meant to be the Conservatives' favourite Liberal Democrat, and you, Jeremy, I am assured are one of David Cameron's favourite Liberal Democrat ministers. Wouldn't it be extremely helpful to you if at least in both of your seats the Conservatives ran a low-key campaign next time? Would you welcome that? Would you?
I wouldn't expect it. I would expect for all of the parties to do what they always do, which is focus on the seats where they are most likely to win. Parties put resources where they think that they have a high prospect of winning, and they don't put resources where they have a low prospect of winning. And that isn't some secret electoral pact. It's plain common sense.
There was a gentleman.
Can I say,
yes.
I think I'm the only Lib Dem MP who won back a seat that we had lost to the Conservatives, and it was extremely close contest, and we have a very robust political exchange with the Conservatives in my constituent, and that's perfectly reasonable and appropriate thing to do, even in a coalition scenario.
So if there is going to be a pact, you'll be a good candidate. Right, the gentleman there.
The Conservative
How did you come to that interpretation of what I just said?
The Conservative MP, Jess Norman, who's a big guru of the big society, said recently at a Westminster meeting, suggested that it's time to roll back the frontiers of the market. Now, if you look around in different areas, you can look at failure on reducing CO2 emissions, you can look at soaring rail prices, you can look at the private care homes scandal, you can look at the Public Accounts Committee criticising what's happening with welfare to work contractors, a newspaper industry behaving like the Stasi, and of course the really big one is the credit markets that have left us with the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. It may even be worse than that. So would you agree with that Conservative colleague that it is indeed time to roll back the frontiers of the market?
I don't think you identified yourself, did you?
I'm Tim Nichols, I'm a member of the Hackney Party.
So what do you think of that?
No, I wouldn't particularly. I mean, and incidentally, in many of those areas, you know, reflecting on your list, I was thinking, blimey, I remember when the state was responsible itself for some of these things, and what a great balls up it made, you know, the days when British Rail was running our railway system, and you know, if you wanted a timetable, you looked under the fiction department of W.H. Smith because none of the trains turned up on time. Nobody is saying that the market is the perfect solution to everything in the world, and actually I think in one of the most important areas for the government, which is public service reform, we have to recognise that quite often the market is more sclerotic than we would like it to be. You know, in areas like mine, there aren't 8 different choices of secondary school. There is often one secondary school, and the chances of new providers coming into the secondary school market, particularly with scarce capital, are not all that high. And I think it's very important for our government to not only seek to give people more choice and competition where it's available, but also to be pragmatic and to recognise that choice and competition in areas of public services is not always a cure-all solution, and that with more freedom to innovate also goes the need to have accountability mechanisms that make sure that where choice and competition isn't working, there is an accountability mechanism to make sure you'll continue to drive up public services. So I think that we need to be pragmatic. We need to make sure that, you know, similarly in areas of the National Health Service, where the previous government relied upon very top-down mechanisms for reform, we should be looking not to be so reliant upon top-down mechanisms of reform, but we should recognise that sometimes the accountability mechanisms that they introduced in areas such as waiting times and waiting lists are quite important in systems that cannot rely only on the market to solve all of the problems.
Can I quickly comment?
Just very quickly, yeah.
I don't think markets are perfect, but I'm Foreign Office Minister responsibility for Asia and Latin America, and we would be going against the grain because there are countries, particularly across Asia, that have embraced free market economics in the last few decades and are reaping huge benefits. Literally hundreds of millions of people are seeing vastly improved living standards as a result of the competition and disciplines and choice that markets bring about. And even in some of the areas that you cited, I think that the state has a role to play in tackling climate change, but I think the innovation that private companies can bring to this task is very important as well. And the most statist economies in Eastern Europe were also the ones that polluted the most, and the ones that were most free market were in many cases those that took the greatest care on the environment. So I don't accept that there is an automatic correlation in these areas between, if you like, a sort of quality of living outcomes and a reduction in the role of the market. In fact, I think the opposite is the case.
Before David and Jeremy have to go, there's a lady over there against the wall who try and squeeze her in before the part, and then get on to the other speakers. Yes.
Kishra Faulkner, House of Lords. David and Jeremy, if we're going to get any credit for economic competence in 2015, and if we want more than just that, then I think we have to address the Liberal dilemma. And both of you have touched upon it, but not really expanded on it. And it is this, that while muscular liberalism is asserting itself in certain areas of public policy, I notice, particularly in the House of Lords, that we are very weak on weaning ourselves off the easy option of applying to producer interests, rather than going for what the natural liberal in me says we should be doing, which is giving consumer choice and all those other things that come with efficiency in delivery of public services, as a good liberal should, if they care about individual liberty, rights and protection. How do we resolve this dilemma?
David?
Well, I think I very much agree with you that we need, part of the challenge for us is how you empower citizens, taxpayers, consumers, call it what you will. And indeed, one of the reservations I had about some of the proposals that came out on the NHS were that they seem to empower the producer element within the NHS more than consumers. And actually, we've got to be careful about that, because in many areas across the country, GPs, for example, who we're looking to empower through the commissioning process, have been some of the most conservative people in delivering change in the interest of consumers, because they're sometimes driven by their own concerns and working practices rather than those that suit consumers. in other in other parts of government policy, including in the education area that I mentioned earlier on, I think we are doing more to give power to parents within the system, to make the system more responsive to the consumer, if you like. But I would also come back to the point I made a moment ago, which is that when we do those things, we should also do it in a way which is informed by liberal ideology and principles, but mixes that with a degree of pragmatism. If we think in the education system that only by freeing up the market, that only by allowing free schools to come in, that we will solve all of the problems of school standards, we will find that we've got another thing coming. Because sometimes the market is quite sclerotic in the way in which it deals with these things. Sometimes it's not possible to have 5 different secondary school providers in rural parts of the country to create that market that we would like to see. And therefore it's very important that in moving things to a more liberal, devolved, free direction compared with the sort of top-down control that New Labour sought to exercise, that we do so in a pragmatic way and in a way in which freedom is balanced with systems of accountability to make sure that we're not only reliant upon the market.
I want to make 2 observations about it.
Quickly, please.
One is, when I said about the great prize for us being that there were 3 viable parties of government, the biggest key to unlocking that prize is for us to demonstrate sustained economic competence, in my view. And you know, people have looked at us. If you'd asked people before the general election, what do the Lib Dems say to you? People would say they seem quite nice, they seem quite reasonable, they run the recycling rota very well on the local parish council. They're decent, they've got a hard-working MP, much harder than they used to be when I had that MP from another party. Like some of the policies, I like Vince Cable, but I'm not sure I'm going to vote for them. And you say, how come? You like them all so much. And they say, because when it comes to the crunch, could you really see these people making some hard-headed decisions in government that, you know, that would withstand pressure in the short term because it would yield long-term benefits to the country? I would be nervous about believing the Lib Dems were capable of doing that. I think that's what people say. And actually, we have completely confounded those critics, and I think we have exceeded expectations. But the people who want to feel betrayed by the Lib Dems in government are going to spot betrayal much quicker than the people who are willing to be convinced by our competence will spot competence. So it is a longer term process. We can't just be competent for a week and then say, job done. We've been out of government for 70 years. And I think that is the task that we have to stick to. And very quickly on the public service area, people say, oh, I don't know about choice in public services. And I accept that it is not an absolute, you know, it's not a pure solution, as the point that David made. If you look at something like education, there is choice already in education. If you've got enough money to either send your child to a fee-paying school or to move your house from a catchment area of a lower performing school to a catchment area of a higher performing school. And I meet people in my own constituency who are moving home, and I said, oh, your home looks perfectly nice. And they said, it's because our children are 10 years old. That's why we're moving home. And they've got the money to afford to buy a house, which costs £30,000 or £40,000 more than it otherwise would do, which is basically the market factoring in the cost of having the state school with that house in its catchment area that is perceived by the parent to be a higher performing school. And our task as a party is to give those opportunities and that choice to the people who can't afford to pay private school fees and can't afford to move home. And I don't think we as a party should be nervous about extending choice. I think we should embrace that, but think imaginatively about how we do it.
Okay, well, gentlemen, we must let you get off to your dinner, and don't bid too much at the auction. And thank you very much.
You bought a £5 table, and you know.
Right, and if the others would like to. Now, Simon Goldie, communications man, PR man, blogger with Liberal Vision. What's your take on all that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to also congratulate you, Michael, because I feel I don't want to be left out.
Well, that's enough congratulations for tonight.
When I looked at the questions that were posed for this event, I was starting to work out what I thought were the answers, and in doing that, I thought, well, actually, I think there's something else about all this, and it's that the party is rather misunderstood and arguably maybe it slightly misunderstands itself. And it's not very good at communicating, or hasn't been very good at communicating what it's about. And I think there's a range of reasons for that, and I think they're quite important and explain perhaps what the party needs to do next. So the reasons, I think, are partly because the liberal political tradition is very rich, there's lots of diverse contributors to it. The party also is, as we all know, is a merged party, so we have the SDP, a different political tradition, but some sort of similarities in sort of being influenced by utilitarianism. For many, many years, the party was fighting local campaigns. It has to fight on local issues, so there was always that accusation, well, in one part of the country we were saying X, in another part of the country we were saying Y. It doesn't quite make sense. And also the party has not been, I think, sort of ideologically committed to a vision of tax, or to how you do tax. So under the last Conservative administration, when public expenditure was low, it felt that there should be a little bit higher tax for education. But under Labour, when it felt there was enough spending, it said, right, well, let's start moving tax down. And with the deficit, that's changed everything again. So we're seeing a sort of an evolution of thinking of liberal ideas, but also lots of different things funneling in to what the party is about. I think inevitably being in government changes a political party. Suddenly it can fight a national campaign. It doesn't have to sort of concentrate that much on all those local ones. And in an economic situation that we're in, also changes the party. I think all of that, to me, says, and I mean, David and Jeremy are incredibly eloquent about what liberalism is to them or what the party should be saying. I think, for me, what the party has to do is work out its liberal or Democrat narrative, to work out policies that reinforce that, to implement those policies in government and demonstrate to the electorate it's done it, and then to present the electorate in 2015 with a very strong, clear, dare I say it, vision of what Britain should look like and what it's done to help Britain looking like that. And I think all those things will help the party avoid a rather grim electoral result post-May. And if it doesn't do that, I think it's in for a tough situation. Because if it presents itself as being having been an internal opposition that's constantly trying to stop the nasty things going on but not actually contributing positively, if it doesn't have a very clear, absolutely focused set of policies, then the voters will go, well, what are you about, what's going on? So I think it has been misunderstood. It's partly its own fault that it has, and it needs to sort that out. Listening to both MPs, you would say it is doing that, but I think I only just arrived at the conference this evening. From what I've heard, there's been some other kind of conversations, debates, where you get a very different slant and view of what the Liberal Democrats are about. So I think my challenge to the party, to all of us, is to sort that out.
Now, thank you very much indeed, Simon. James Forsyth, I'm sorry there are one or two people here tonight who were expecting Peter Oborne. This is not Peter Oborne, but we've got just as good, if not better, in James Forsyth of The Spectator. What's your take on all of this? I mean, to what extent has the Liberal Democrats, have they changed? Have they changed for the better? And how permanently have they changed?
Jeremy Browne claimed that Liberal Democrats are now the natural party of government, a claim that would have been laughed out of town 5 years ago. I'm going to make another claim that would have been laughed out of anywhere but this room 5 years ago. I think the Liberal Democrats are now the most interesting party in British politics. Why? Because I think we're seeing the most radical attempt to reform what a party stands for we've seen in British politics in a long time. In some ways it is far more radical than what Tony Blair attempted with the Labour Party even. Because I think what we're seeing is an attempt to change a party that under Charlie Kennedy's leadership was attempting to replace Labour as the premier social democratic party in British politics, with an attempt to create a liberal party that we haven't seen in British politics for a long time. I mean, they're familiar on the continent, but we haven't had them in Britain yet. Liberal parties with a reputation for economic competence, and a commitment to kind of personal freedom slash responsibility, as Jeremy Browne was putting it. Now, a reputation for economic competence is the hardest thing to gain in politics and the easiest thing to lose. The Tories lost their reputation for economic competence in a matter of hours on Black Wednesday. So I think that there is undoubtedly a huge challenge for Liberal Democrats here in becoming a party that people trust with their money, essentially. And I think the first thing I would say, which I think the leadership grasps completely, is that the first step to a reputation for economic competence has to be you have bet the house on the deficit reduction strategy, essentially, for good or ill. I think probably for good. But if the Liberal Democrats are seen as a party to constantly be reluctant about deficit reduction, to be unhappy with the strategy, it will ensure that you get all of the blame for the cuts and none of the credit if deficit reduction is seen to work. So I think that would be the first thing I'd say. The second thing I would say is that I think if you look at the party now, have they woken up to economic reality? Listening to David Laws and Jeremy Browne, you would say, yes, it's completely unquestioning. But if you listen to Tim Farron in the hall yesterday and how he was received by the hall, you would say, no, they haven't. And I think so what we are seeing here is this clash. I think there is a liberal group around the leadership at the top. And then there is a far more of a social democratic base to the party, which is, I think, far less comfortable with a lot of the things that David and Jeremy were talking about this evening, whether it be deficit reduction or choice in public services. And I think if you look at some of the rhetoric around the 50p tax rate, now, I think you can say that the 50p tax rate is a necessary political sop to maintain popular support for deficit reduction. But the idea that it is something that we should become a kind of permanent feature of the British tax landscape, when the top rate of tax in France is 41p, is I think, slightly absurd. And so the party needs to decide what it wants to be. And I understand that if you join this party because you're a social democrat, you are unlikely to agree with the party becoming a liberal party. I think that is in some ways reasonable enough, obviously. But if you look at the electoral landscape and where the political opportunities are for the Liberal Democrats, I think they actually are on the liberal side of the spectrum. First of all, I think British politics remains tribal to an extent, in that I don't think it is possible to replace the Labour Party as the social democratic party of British politics. I think you tried that, and you had incredibly good circumstances to do that in 2005. You had the Iraq War, trust, all of those things. And if you couldn't do it then, and really, frankly, even come close to doing it then, you're not going to do it now. The next thing I would say is, I think you do have an opportunity to replace the people who voted for you because you weren't going to get power, the kind of protest voters, with the people who didn't vote for you because they didn't think you could win. And I think there are a large swathe of voters who one might call soft Tories, or the kind of people who switched from the Tories to Labour in '97, who I think the Liberal Democrats really could appeal to. And I think you have a particular chance to appeal to them because Ed Miliband believes in a way that Margaret Thatcher believed in the 1970s, that politics had changed, had undergone a sea change moment, and the country was ready to be led to the right. Ed Miliband believes the country is ready to be led to the left and is trying to take it back. Whether he will succeed or not is another question, but that does open up some territory on the centre ground. I think the other thing is what the coalition has done to the Conservatives. If you look at the issues where the Tories and Liberal Democrats are most publicly rallying at the moment, Europe, the Human Rights Act, immigration, these are all issues with which the Tories ran amongst themselves between 2005 and 2010. And if you look at the position that David Cameron is saying that he would take now, compared to the position he was saying he would take before the 2010 election, he himself has moved to the right on all three issues. So I think the Tory manifesto in 2015 will be a far more clearly right-wing document than their manifesto at the last election was, which again creates space in the centre for the Liberal Democrats. So I think if Nick Clegg can take his party with him. And if the party is prepared, as he urged it to do today, to stop obsessing about the voters it's lost and start thinking about the new voters it could recruit, then I think there is a real chance. But as David Law said, the danger is that if the opinion polls look bad in 2014, the prospect of rolling over and having your tummies tickled by Tim Farron and some social democratic red meat could be very appealing to your fellow delegates. And so I think really the question as to whether you wake up to economic reality is in your own hands.
Thank you, James. What fascinates me is whether we've seen within all three parties in the last 20 years revolutions, the Blair Revolution, the Cameron Revolution, the Orange Book Revolution, that were revolutions by small numbers of people that were probably minorities within their party, that the bulk of the party went along with because they were electorally desperate, in the case of Blair and in the case of the Cameron Revolution. And of course we saw with Blair how it unravelled once he'd gone and has lost, much of New Labour is gone. With Cameron, we don't know. And what fascinates me is how permanent the Orange Book Revolution is. We saw two of its representatives here, but there's certainly not a majority of the parliamentary Liberal Democrat Party, as far as I can see, and certainly not a majority of the party. So it seems to me there is a hell of a lot of persuading that the instigators of this coup who've taken over this party for the last 5 years or so have got to do to create that permanence in a way that the Blair Revolution obviously failed to do and was confined, really, in my view, just to a few dozen people. Anyway, maybe Mark will pick up on some of those thoughts and no doubt have a lot more. Mark, former head of media for the Liberal Democrats, professional troublemaker, professional smoker, and Director General of the IEA.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of persuasion to be done, Michael, by those of a market-orientated opinion within the party. But I was going to try and address some of these questions, being has the party changed, has it grown up? It's difficult to say. I just wanted to make a couple of observations and then raise a few questions. Jean Monnet always said about the British that the British are never moved by ideas, but they are moved by facts. And it does seem that the single fact of the catastrophic fiscal position that was going to be inherited by whoever ultimately formed the government in May 2010 was going to be a major factor in developing government policy. And it's always interesting to run these what-ifs. Had there been a majority Conservative government carrying out exactly the deficit reductions currently being carried out by the coalition, would the Liberal Democrats be warmly applauding those reductions from the opposition benches? I query whether or not the Liberal Democrats would be acting in that fashion. However, in terms of the party's discipline on the issues, it's staggered me, frankly, how tightly disciplined the Liberal Democrats have been, even if the Orange Book tendency is not a majority of the parliamentary party. My sort of assumption was that the party conference last year in Liverpool, wasn't it, that there wouldn't be any rumblings of discontent then, that there probably wasn't anyone there who could remember Lloyd George or Herbert Asquith. So the mere fact that the party was now in government was, reason enough to be happy and cheerful. But that 12 months hence, you would start to see real splits and cracks appearing, especially, as Jeremy was alluding to, in the wake of the defeat of electoral reform so decisively. But none of that either. I think the poll conducted by Liberal Democrat Voice showed that 86% of Liberal Democrat activists are still supportive of the coalition. That's pretty remarkable. However, there are going to be some further challenges on this score. If you believe the actual growth numbers that are coming out, not entirely in the gift of the government, but if you believe the actual growth numbers coming out rather than the OBR projections, and if you believe, and I think that James is right on this score, that both coalition parties have hung their hat on deficit reduction, then you've got a problem, because tax revenues are not going to be as substantial as we were hoping. If you're anticipating 2.5%, 3% growth perhaps, and it's actually going to end up at perhaps a bit less than 1%. So how is that going to be addressed? Are you actually going to allow a structural budget deficit still to exist by the time of the next election? Are there any other tax rises that can be made that will actually bring in revenue? Or is there going to have to be a second round of a spending review and cuts? And that's going to be a challenge. And unless you predict a very optimistic upswing in the economy, that is actually going to happen. One way or another, that's going to have to be faced. I think there's been some tough lessons for the Liberal Democrats. The tuition fees lesson. I'm sorry to bring up AV and tuition fees. I don't really want to move on from those some time ago. But that to me was extremely instructive. And I have to say, I'm only relying on Twitter. I haven't heard where Vince said this directly, but apparently he said earlier, being honest, we weren't expecting to be in government when we made this pledge. Well, I can sort of see where he's coming from. I mean, I remember speaking, the person will remain nameless, but I was speaking to a Liberal Democrat MP as the tuition fees vote was approaching, and they said to me very candidly, look, the truth of the matter is that I think actually on reflection I made an extremely stupid promise. The moral dilemma is whether you should keep an extremely stupid promise or break an extremely stupid promise. And I think that has been a tough lesson, not particularly on that policy, even though you may cherish it, but that has been a breach of trust. And I think that the electorate would have seen that as a red line issue. And it was not obviously one that the party fought for. I mean, I much prefer what the coalition's doing than to what the Liberal Democrat policy was, but nevertheless there's a trust point. If you make a big play of something and then don't deliver it when you're actually come into government, even if that's a surprise to you, pay a price. A few questions. And this goes to trying to sharpen the focus of the party and what could it look like in years to come if this sort of direction of travel was to continue. Firstly, lots of Liberal Democrats have said, oh, very grim and terrible circumstances at the moment, and you know, I've got to do this, but I didn't come into office to cut government spending. I'd like to get some sort of sense and feel of what size of state the Liberal Democrats are comfortable with. I mean, is it about right that 50% of national income is being spent by the government? A bit on the low side? A bit on the high side? I mean, certainly through the Labour years of increased government spending, it was the position of the party to typically, I mean, perhaps not be supportive of the way it was apportioned, but to be broadly supportive of that rise, and even on occasions to say it should go further still. So what is the optimum size of the state? And I think you can have a serious philosophical discussion with that without getting it tied down into, you know, are you being a mean right-wing Tory who hates poor people because you want to cut back the size of the state? I don't feel that there's a good answer to that question yet. The second, we've heard a lot about this from the leading lights of the Lib Dems over the past few days, goes to fairness. And I think there is a distinction between the two coalition parties on this point about what the nature of the tax base should be. So there's what I think is actually going to be a phony war over the 50p rate. I suspect that the Treasury report will show that it is revenue negative, and you would have to be a rather peculiar extremist to believe that we should have a tax that doesn't raise revenue. But nevertheless, it goes to this argument about what a fair structure should look like. Yes, of course the rich should pay their fair share, but what is that fair share? I mean, the top 1% of earners at the moment pay about 25% of income tax receipts. The top 10% pay a bit more than half of income tax receipts. Is that fair? Is that a bit too much? A bit too little? And so there always just seems to be a nudge towards the rich paying more without any real sense of what the final destination point would look like and what the size of the state should be and what the tax base should actually be in an optimum Liberal Democrat world. Final point really goes to what I was hoping was going to be some rather dramatic Liberal reforms. If you'll remember that Nick Clegg said upon becoming Deputy Prime Minister he was going to bring in the Great Repeal Act, biggest radical shift and change in the relationship between the individual and the state since 1832. I'm not quite sure what's come of it. I think it's going to Theresa May's in tray, but it certainly hasn't been the most radical recalibration between the individual and the state even this year. And it does seem to me that, and I think that the Liberal Democrats could augment some of what they're saying in a more pro-business, pro-growth direction if the party were to embrace this, that a war on deregulation that the Conservative Party has conclusively failed to carry out, Whitehall-generated regulation has gone up since the coalition government came to power. Despite all these one-in, one-out rules, it's gone up, putting aside what's coming in from Europe. Could the Liberal Democrats grab that and actually say, no, we're going to be serious about deregulating? We're not going to come out with announcements about, you know, yet more regulation, banning children's clothing for being too sexy, or insisting that pictures of women in Vogue magazine that are airbrushed are labelled. No, we're going to put that to one side. We're going to look at the present stock of red tape, and we're going to take a torch to it. And the Conservatives are struggling to do any of this at all. And it seems to me that is a very liberal thing to do, and could actually potentially position the Liberal Democrats as almost being sort of on the side of small businesses. I think the Conservatives are often seen to be on the side of big business. Big business, by the way, who are quite often quite happy with the regulatory burden because it acts as a barrier to entry. I'd like to see the Liberal Democrats take that one on. And I wonder, this is probably unchangeable, I don't know what the nature of the deal is, whether actually, although 5 cabinet ministers and a whole swathe of junior ministers looks like a good deal, whether actually the Liberal Democrats have sort of got the wrong ministries. I mean, the really major ministry in Liberal Democrat control is energy and climate change. Probably not going to do much, it's going to be very popular with the electorate, let's be honest. So you've actually got other areas where there are Liberal Democrat embeds, but the government would generally be associated with the free school strategy. That's not to say that Liberal Democrats can't claim credit for the pupil premium, but I think if you I don't think there's a line of spin, the idea that 75% of the Liberal Democrat manifesto has been implemented, but it might encourage you in this room, but I don't think it encourages the electorate at all. I think if you ask them to list what the 75% was, it wouldn't get you very far. And one very final point about future honesty. And this is, I think, a problem. And the Liberal Democrats are not uniquely guilty here, but troubles me about our democracy. It was stark staring obvious, I think, to anyone who picked up a copy of the Financial Times in the run-up to the general election last year, that there was a catastrophic fiscal problem and that the budget deficit was about £160 billion. You didn't need to wait for a note from Liam Byrne saying we're bust as you rolled up at the Treasury. Yet none of the 3 political parties addressed that in the general election. It has been sort of presented, and I'm sure it would have been the same if Labour had been re-elected, as if somehow a whole load of invoices were found behind the sofa the day after the general election. In fact, it turned out that the budget deficit wasn't quite as bad as some of the forecasts were stating, about £10 billion less bad. And I think we're going to have a problem in our democracy if we're not direct and honest with the electorate about the state of public finances. And despite the fact that the Liberal Democrats, I think for obvious reasons, have taken an absolute bath in the polls and have done badly in the local elections, that the newfound honesty about the state of the economy is probably the most substantial shift and potentially paints a path of the party finding its way back from the 10% sort of levels that it's on now to the 20% or so levels it would need to grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Right, the gentleman over there, and then 2 or 3 people over here. Yeah.
Yes, Tim Loyney. My voice is probably loud enough. Just to ask, following on Mark's comments about deregulation, the Liberal Democrats are running Biz. They have Vince Cable and Ed Davey. They have got privatisation of Royal Mail on the books. They've deregulated maternity leave and employment regulations. We're not really seeing the same from the Tories. The Treasury's been very quiet on this. At one point they suggested deregulating flammability standards for soft furnishings, but it doesn't strike me as the obvious place to start for a regulatory revolution. I think that's something that deregulators have to think about. Which bits of regulation do they want to keep and which bits do they want to get rid of? And there I think Lib Dems are doing quite well in government.
Some contributions from over here. Yes, the gentleman there.
I'll just go. Yeah, well...
Explain who you are.
Sorry, James King, Camden, Lib Dems. Yeah, well, intellectually, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of positioning as an economically liberal, social liberal party. I just wonder if anybody can think of any international examples of where that proves to be electorally successful. The Free Democrats, I think, are sort of in that space in Germany, and I think their poll ratings never even get as high as our poll ratings at the moment. I think the Progressive Democrats in Ireland played at that for a bit, and they're now defunct. And it just in a first past the post system, it's even more challenging to see if that's an electorally successful strategy. So I just wonder if anybody has any good examples of that working electorally.
And gentleman there, with the nearer one with the beard, yes.
David Akerman from Taunton, Deane.
Good.
If the fiscal position is better in 2015, why will the Lib Dems get the credit rather than the bigger partner in the coalition?
And finally, the chap at the back.
Alistair Colin McGregor from the City of Nottingham. I'd just like to address the point that was made over the government spending. From conversations I've had within the party generally, it's not so much the level of government spending that irks, so much as the inherent inefficiency of government spending that was implemented under the last government.
Right, thank you. I mean, it strikes me, Mark mentioned electoral reform, which obviously is now off the agenda for quite a while, but 2 other E's that we were always associating the Liberal Democrats and the Liberals with were Europe and the environment. And the sense I get is that certainly Europe's place on the Liberal Democrat agenda is a lot less than it used to be, and I detect that the same has happened with the environment too, although maybe not. But are these ways which the party is also changing, and is that permanent, or is that just a matter of political expediency at the moment or not? Anyway, any thoughts on any of these? Simon?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the environment, and Chris Huhn, who he wrote a chapter in the Orange Book, I think, but not necessarily seen as always an Orange Book, but is trying to create a market under a regulatory environment. And so I think it goes back to kind of my theme of the misunderstanding of the party, is that while somebody who, and Chris came from the SDP, so while some people in the party are seen as not as friendly as markets, that's not always the case. There are lots of questions, so I'll pick up, I think, just one, if I may, and that's the one about whether there are examples of an economic and social liberal party doing well. Actually, I can't think of any. It's a similar. But for me, I think the point is that the Liberal Democrats need to have a very clear proposition when they go to the voters. And if the voters don't like that proposition, well, fair enough, but they need to have it. And it's either, in my view, going to be a liberal one, or it's going to be something else, and it should sort of work that out. And everybody in this room will have a preference, I assume, and they'll make decisions or campaign for their preference, and if they don't get their preference, they'll do something about that. But I think it's absolutely crucial to be clear, and I don't think the party is being clear enough. And I think that I believe, and fair enough, Vince, I think, said today that he's a social democrat, and that's where he came from, that's his political tradition. That's fine, the party made a choice to merge, but it now needs to kind of go beyond all that and sort out what does liberal democracy mean, or what does the liberalism bit of it mean to the voters, really.
James?
Well, I mean, for an economically liberal and socially liberal party that succeeded, I mean, it's a long time ago, but I would say Eisenhower Republicanism in the US is an example of, they were in that space. They were the most socially liberal party in US politics at the time, and also the most economically liberal. I think in terms of the deficit reduction strategy and the credit, this is undoubtedly the biggest challenge for any junior coalition partner. But if you guys are seen to be reluctant accomplices, the Tories will be able to say in 2015, well, we did it, no thanks to the Liberal Democrats, while at the same time Labour go around blaming you for every Sure Start that's being closed, every funding crisis in every hospital. So you're going to end up with the worst of both worlds unless you own this deficit reduction strategy as much as you can. I think to go back to the question which was actually asked to David Laws and Jeremy Browne about the North and the South, I think there's actually in some ways a fundamentally bigger challenge happening to our politics, which is, I think you've got something potentially very dangerous going on, which is, if you look at the states, it is entirely red states and blue states in a very predictable way. I think we're getting to a situation where we're getting a more market liberal, set of politics in the South, which are now increasingly outside London and urban centres, Lib Dem Tory contests. And if you look at, and then in the North, you're getting a situation where, especially now we're in opposition, Labour clean up because the economy is so dependent on the state. I think one of the big challenges of the coalition when it talks about rebalancing the economy is not to kind of take a bit off London and stick it somewhere else. It is to hugely reduce the size of the state in large parts of the north of England, where it is at a level that would not have embarrassed the former Soviet bloc in some places. And I don't think that any party with a liberal view of economics is going to have much of a chance in the north in future if this continues. And so I think that is a real challenge. But I would say the one thing that you should give you some consolation in the north is that one of the most interesting things about the Oldham East and Saddleworth by-election is it showed that Tory voters got tactical voting almost instantly. And I think you will see a lot of Tories vote Lib Dem to keep Labour out in the north of England, in the same way that you get lots of Tories in Scotland voting SNP to keep Labour out. So I think that actually could be a bit of a boost for you in the north, even if you don't like where the votes are coming from.
Well, Mark, this is your organisation, so perhaps you'd like to finish up with your thoughts.
Well, if you agree with Tim on some of the Lib Dem efforts on deregulation, my point was let's make that an ace of trumps. Right? I think Vince today in his speech made literally one reference to it, and that's why we've got to cut regulation. That was it. There wasn't any announcement of a war on red tape or of cutting it back. I think that could be run by Liberal Democrats, but it just seems to be, we've had a few successes in this department and a few in that one. Make that a centrepiece of the Liberal Democrat approach in government, and I think that sends a positive pro-business, pro-growth message in contrast to the failings of the Conservative Party. In terms of successful economically liberal parties elsewhere, you're stretching my knowledge of European politics to the absolute limit, and I will be about 15 or 20 years out of date. So I'm not saying that these have recently happened, but certainly have happened in living memory. In Holland and in Belgium, the three-party system would seem to be broadly Social Democrat, Christian Democrat and Liberal. The VVD, for example, and the Dutch and the Belgian Liberals have performed pretty creditably in a range of elections. The UDF in France, to some extent. I think that there are good examples of that. In terms of taking the credit, this is going to be, this is totally uncharted territory. And this is the problem. I've been writing some newspaper articles about it today. It does seem to me sort of natural that if you're average Joe voter and you pretty much like what the coalition's doing, the tendency, disproportionately, is going to be to vote Tory. And if you don't like what the coalition's doing, the tendency is going to be to vote Labour, UKIP, Green, British National Party, whatever reflects your view. And my sort of slight worry about some of the messages coming across on television over the past 2 days is that the party seems to be appealing to a slice of the electorate which likes the coalition but doesn't like the rich. And I think that is a pretty thin slice of the electorate, as the opinion poll ratings attest. The point I'd make on the psephology, though, is this, and it doesn't, I'm afraid, address the point from the gentleman from Central Manchester raised. But broadly speaking, Liberal Democrats have been and are electorally successful in what you might call centre-right seats. Broadly speaking. Most of the battles are against the Conservatives. They're generally in areas that are disproportionately wealthy. Not hugely wealthy, but generally. Somebody said to me, if you've got leafy roads, a cathedral and a university in the constituency, it's a Lib Dem target. You don't actually need to go through the figures with Chris Renard. And there's a lot of truth in that. That generally speaking, the breakthroughs, seats have come and gone, but Cheltenham, Oxford West, Newbury, Winchester, Bath, Bristol West, these are not, these are centre-right constituencies where the main battle is against the Conservative Party. In fact, when I was working for the party in 2005, and of course it was more or less as you were against the Conservatives, and there was quite a lot of gains from the Labour Party, a dozen or so. But interestingly, if you went through those gains from the Labour Party seats like Falmouth and Camberwell, Birmingham, Yardley and the likes, they were nearly all seats that had been held by the Tories under Margaret Thatcher. So even though they looked on it that it was a sort of centre-left battle, if you like, they were actually seats. Even Lynn Featherston's seat, which was a fight against Labour, was one with a very centre-right tradition. So I would think, although this doesn't help get the vote up across 600, and however many seats it's going to be, presumably 600 if the Boundary Commission goes through, the challenge is this: could you get in seats like Taunton and Yeovil a good enough bounce to encourage Conservative voters who didn't previously trust Jeremy or David and were worried that that might let Gordon Browne back in power, to now vote Liberal Democrat? And if you like, centre-right leaning voters in Liberal Democrat held seats are now more inclined to vote Liberal Democrat, then even in the face of a falling vote share, there's every prospect that 50, 60 seats could be won, even on a much lower vote share. That segment of the electorate is crucial for the party's targeting strategy. Just the last point on government spending that the gentleman at the back raised, that it's not so much the level, it's the efficiency. Well, yes, I would probably prefer to live in a country where the spending was 50% done very, very efficiently rather than 45% completely wasted. But I still think there is a broad number that one has to have in mind. 90% spent efficiently, I don't think would be a particularly liberal society. However brilliantly run the 90% of GDP was. So I'm not saying that there are perfect answers to these questions, but I think at the moment the party's in danger of skirting around them in what is still a slightly oppositionalist way rather than a blueprint way.
I
And if we get to more of a blueprint, then I think the party would grow up.
Final point,
Just to jump in and say one thing. I think on the size of the state, I think all three parties in politics are massively skirting around the issue. I think, you know, state spending has got a lot, because of the financial crisis, it has got a lot larger as a percentage of GDP than it was before. I don't think we have any idea. The Tories are, because of Oliver Letwin's various previous attempts to do it, didn't go so well. The Tories are incredibly scared about talking about any kind of ideal percentage. Labour seem to be basically slightly in favour of the status quo, without seeming to recognise that the status quo is now 50%. When you say to them, but so you think 50% is about right, they go, no, we think somewhere in the 40s. And you're like, well, no, hang on a second, where are you? So there's that. And so I don't think the Liberal Democrats are alone. I think this comes back to Mark's point, is I think we've got a real, I mean there are two options for British politics right now, frankly. One is we end up going towards a much smaller state model and resolving to try and compete with the new emerging economies in a global marketplace. The other is that we decide that we will keep the current level and just basically gradually decline in comfort. And I think that is a fundamental choice in British politics, even if no politician wants to talk about it.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. The conference I've seen this last few days seems remarkably cheerful. The party, there's no great punch-up.
Sorry.
To report, or if there is, we haven't seen it yet. And yet, I can't help feeling that Jeremy Browne and David Laws and Mark Littlewood still have a lot of persuading to do for this revolution to be permanent. Although, of course, a lot depends on basically what happens to the deficit reduction programme and what happens to the economy. Anyway, thanks very much, James. Thank you, Simon. Oh yes, and if you could all put your business cards in the box. I don't know what you're going to do with them, but
if you wish to receive the IEA email newsletter, which only comes out once a month, we won't spam you about future events, then please leave your business card in the box or sign the sheet before you go.
Thank you.